There's a big old bombshell that has been dropped. The memo about the scheme to overturn the election has been made public.
The New York Times broke the story, and what they obtained is what was meant to maintain as a secret confidential memo within the Trump plotters' circle. Now, this is actually written by one of the people named by Jack Smith as a Trump co-conspirator, identified as Kenneth Chesebro, and we'll have more on those co-conspirators tonight. But you see right there on the memo his name, as he says, the plan was to, and remember, the Electoral College has voted by December 14th, all of this is settled, and yet in plain English, I'm going to leave it on the screen, this is conspiracy evidence right here. The plan was to, quote, deprive Biden of the electoral votes he basically had won, to keep him under the 270 votes that he'd already won, but to somehow engineer a fraud or a plot to create the pretense or the appearance that he didn't have them on the 6th.
Well, this whole memo right here definitely will lead Trump to jail, or at least should.
And this lawyer in private admits it's a bold, quote, controversial strategy. Now, this circulated in early December. And talk about receipts. Some of this was happening in secret at the time. Some of it stayed secret for a long time. But as we learned bits and pieces about the elector fraud plot, there are journalists and investigators who kind of said, wait a minute, this is bigger than it first looked. This is a real kind of crime that's spilling out into the open. Not the only, but one of the first was Rachel Maddow, our colleague. This was just within a week here when she reported on some of these events in real time.
Wisconsin cast its electoral votes for Biden and Harris today. Pennsylvania cast its electoral votes for Biden and Harris today. Georgia, Arizona. But it did get weird. I mean, in Arizona, I kid you not, Republicans in Arizona sent a forged certificate of ascertainment to the National Archives in Washington, pretending that they were the real electors from Arizona and their votes for Trump are real and should be counted by the United States Senate. Literally, they sent a forged document.
That's exactly right. You can see it up here on the screen in comparison. Forged, fraud.
That is election interference, and those people should have been put in jail if they haven't already been.
Rachel was drilling down on that at a time when many people were saying, oh, it's over, let Trump make his noise, we'll move on. She was saying, well, wait a minute, if it's a forgery, that's not only news, that's potentially illegal. That's a problem. It was many months later when the Congressional January 6th Committee got those notes together, conferred with the archives that had received them. You can't send fraudulent documents to the government. Not for any reason, by the way. You could do that on any government form, it's illegal. And there's a hierarchy to that. Because if you do it to the IRS about money versus doing it to the DOJ about guns and drugs versus doing it to the National Archives in Congress about stealing a federal election or the presidential one, yeah, you're going up the line with your fraud. Now, there were apparently Trump fans who were fraudulent electors that were also lied to. If you watch this show, you may recall I mentioned this, that Jack Smith, in either his precision or his fairness or whatever you want to call it, makes very clear in the indictment that while he sees some people doing crimes and wants to hold them accountable, he was very precise of saying it seemed that some of these rabid Trump fans were lied to. And again, if you're lied to, you might not be on the hook for the criminal standard of indictment. Very simple example before I move on. If somebody comes over to your house and says, hey, you just moved in, you're new in the neighborhood, I made you some cookies, and they give them to you and you receive them and you don't know that they're pot cookies or heroin cookies and you have them in your house, you don't actually meet the criminal standard of guilt because you weren't trying to have a drug item in your house. It's quite the opposite if you and your friend conspire to take a box of drugs around. And so Smith, very simply, very fairly in the indictment said some of these people were lied to. Now, to the new memo. A co-conspirator, who we know as Giuliani, falsely assured some of these individuals their certificates would only be used if the defendant succeeded in litigation. I should say that's how Smith mentions it, attributing it to Giuliani.
So some of these people that are claiming to have been duped into voting as an elector were honestly duped into it. I guess they were able to prove that they were to other people and stuff. It seems kind of fishy.
And the memo discusses the same goal, that basically You know you're doing something bad or potentially a conspiracy if you have to not only hide it from the world, but hide it from the people involved. And again, in an abundance of fairness, it's a separate question ethically, morally, or whatever, if you don't like or want to criticize people who are playing games with the elections, right? That's kind of in the public debate. But it's another thing to say that some of these electors, for whatever reason they felt that they loved Donald Trump and wanted to do what the campaign asked, ultimately felt like people who went to Trump University, like people who worked for Donald Trump, like people who were contracted to work in his hotels. It's, yes, an old story, although the stakes were pretty high this time, that they were bamboozled, they were duped, they were lied to.
We were duped.
Michelle Lundgren is the 9th name on the list of accused fake electors charged by Michigan Attorney General Dana Nessel.
We were told to come. They needed us, and we went, and we were given cake and coffee. We were called by a member of the Republican Party. Be sure you come. We really need your help. The scam was bigger than all of us.
That's a Trump fan realizing the scam was bigger than her and that she would be used and discarded or sent off to prison like so many others. Now, that's an open case where the Michigan Attorney General actually feels, and I should say legally concluded, that those people should be responsible. My point is not to resolve all of this tonight. Indeed, anyone accused is going to get their day in court. My point is to very precisely say that
Well, if they can actually prove that they were duped and lied to, well then they should be able to maybe have a, lesser sentence, I guess. But, they are a part of it.
we have a new memo which adds even more details to how much they knew they were doing something bad and secretly conspiring it to do it. Then they take all that stuff, they wanted to jam Mike Pence with it so he might reject the electors. And then the other plot, that again, if you remember our arrows we've shown you, is the state legislators they hoped would somehow get involved and use sham investigations or references to fraud or dead people voting or the elector stuff to somehow thwart, delay, or stop what was going to happen, what did happen, which was, of course, President-elect Biden becoming President Biden. Now, there are people who underestimated this at times. I don't think anyone here on Earth One, as our colleague Nicole says, anyone in reality can underestimate it now because it was a coup attempt with a violent insurrection on top. And as I've told you before, even a bloodless coup attempt is an illegal attack on democracy. You add in a violent insurrection, you have something we're going to be dealing with for years, unless we don't deal with it, and then it will become something that might be in bounds and we lose our democracy. It's happened in many countries. So that's why we've all been pulling these strands. I showed Rachel, I showed some of the other reporting, I showed the investigations. Whenever we can, we invite people on to explain themselves here. We try to give them ample time. We try to do it fairly. And sometimes their own statements seem to incriminate themselves. That was the case for one of the few people who was in the White House up through the 6th and the 20th, Donald Trump's hardcore, longtime loyalist, Peter Navarro, and he discussed parts of this plan right here on this show.
The remedy was for Vice President Pence, as the quarterback in the Green Bay sweep, to remand those votes back to the 6 battleground states.
So you've lost the election, you've lost all the court battles, but you prop up fake scam election investigations and some fake electors. You try to jam them into the 6 and you try to send it back to the states. At a minimum, you're abusing the system and power and fraud to try to at least delay a certification. Now, the new memo, again, I'm going back and forth between what happened, what we knew, and this memo that the Times just got a hold of, has a kind of a self-criticism in it. I don't know why Kenneth Chesebro included this. Maybe he was worried that he would be standing out all alone, looking pretty wild, even among this sort of coup team. So he went out of his way to put in writing that the very plan, which Jack Smith calls a conspiracy, that he was proposing was, quote, kind of wild / creative. I'm just going to leave that there. Now, the New York Times has also pointed to an email from Boris Epstein to a Trump lawyer that discusses these fraudulent alternative votes and that they should call them alternative. That's a better term than fake votes with the smiley face. Now, again, if this were a movie or a story or a play or a cartoon, you could dismiss it all. Be like, this is just sort of, Keystone Cops, clownish. But this was all quite real. And smiley face or not, messaging or not, spin or not, we know what it led to. We know why it's now indicted as a coup conspiracy. Now, Mr. Epstein discussed the plan as well when we asked him about it on the beat. Now, here's a bold assertion as well from this new revealed memo. An invite to print and even TV journalists could be invited to cover the event so that fake electors would sort of try to make it look like a real thing. Now, again, we're going from this newly revealed memo, which builds on his previous memos and some of what the Jan 6 committee found, to footage like this. So in some places, as I told you, they were lying about it, duping the people and saying, hey, keep it secret. But in other places, like Arizona, they said, well, let's make it look official. Hand out some papers, sit around a table. This is one that, as I mentioned, Rachel highlighted at the time. The Arizona GOP uploaded the video online, and they were committing what would appear to be election fraud at the time. Now, you've seen this before. This is something that Donald Trump mastered. It's somewhere between political propaganda and reality show hijinks. If you're going to do the bad thing anyway, then the more you publicize it, launder it, and make people aware of it, tired of it, fatigue them out, the more that later you say, hey, this was no secret. How could it be bad if it wasn't a secret? And the answer, of course, is, well, that was your strategy. And the bad news for some of the co-conspirators is we're seeing it in writing in the memo. That was their strategy. Chesbrough says there should be messaging that presents this as a routine measure. But the memo says it wasn't actually routine. That even if the Supreme Court actually took a case like this, they would end up ruling the power, of course, lies with Congress, not this ridiculous bananas vice president theory, which Pence and others rejected. And there was no evidence of mass voter fraud. And the memo also comes around the same time as two previously reported memos, as I mentioned, which suggest this is part of a big coup conspiracy. The cover-up attempts show the Trump camp knew that as well. So yes, you can give legal advice, and yes, you can go on TV or out in public and give speeches full of lies. You can do those things. But if you start writing down your illegal plan, if you start writing down the details of how you're going to lie to everyone from the government on out, you might be telling on yourself. You might be writing down something that isn't really a memo at all.